Hey, everybody. Switching it up a little bit this week, I'm going to pre-record my healthy aging lecture for you, and we're going to talk all things brains in class. So what makes a good long life? This is the goal that we're aiming toward when we're talking about older adults and health promotion and aging well or healthy aging. And I want to preface this with my usual anti-ageist spiel here that says, you know, one of the difficulties I think that we've had in gerontology and geroscience in the past, maybe even 5 to 6 decades, is this focus on success and what does success look like in aging. And it comes from a good space. Everyone wants to look toward goals and moving forward and something positive, as opposed to, it's a backlash from years and years and years and decades and upon decades and centuries of looking at aging as a disease process in and of itself and as inherently bad and something to avoid, at least in this culture, right? And at different times, pre-industrial revolution, probably for sure, but even further back, this may have not been the way in America. But post-industrial revolution, rise of capitalist values and patriarchal values about getting ahead and being independent, and all the things that we've talked about in this class have made aging inherently bad. So geroscience and gerontology has sort of tried to shift this view towards success and what does success look like, and inadvertently at times have precluded a large number of folks who are aging from attaining quote unquote success, because success was defined rather slimly, and I think a lot of people felt outside that box. So a good long life for me might be very different from you or from someone who has aged with an intellectual disability, someone who has spent their mid to late life with several physical health conditions, someone who may end up in institutional care. However, each one of those scenarios, there are goals to be attained, there is wellness to be had, and there is a good long life ahead of you. And I think that that's been more of the focus in the last decade or so, is to reconceptualize what we're talking about with success and stop inadvertently or just because of ignorance defining successful aging in ways that no one can really attain. It's like the super gero people, where we look at the people who run marathons and say, wow, look at them, they're so great. And yeah, they are great, but so are folk who are living with dementia in the nursing home and able to smile and take a step and recognize their caregiver. There's all kinds along the spectrum, and I think the way in which we define it makes a difference, right? In the way that people are trained, in the way that research is done, in the way that helping professions enact their goals and systems set up their environments and their treatments, in particular in healthcare, to look at what is a good long life for everyone at every different level, right? And certainly we want to think in this time too about those intersections with aging and how that does or doesn't put you at a larger disadvantage across your life course to attain a good long life. However, that doesn't mean you can't have one at all, right? It means that there are ways in which the systems need to change and adapt and better serve and to enable attainment of whatever goals are within your spectrum of living that you want for yourself, or that your family wants for you if you can't make your own decisions necessarily, but they are acting in your best interest. So that's my anti-ageist preamble to healthy aging. We don't want to make this about we don't want to make this exclusionary for folk, right? This is for everyone. There are some things that may not be attainable for different people given, the raw genetic deal that they got, or their health behaviors over time, or the environments in which they were exposed to, et cetera. But that, again, is where we come in, right, as clinicians, where we deal with flexibility and cognition and flexibility and behavior, and really thinking about defining what is your good long life. All right. Step down from soapbox. All right, so I want you to think about this as you're picturing your own self and your own future self, where you have this good long life. And I bet that you can guess what some of these factors are because we've been talking about them, but what do you think gets you there? What types of things get you to this good long life that you can imagine for yourself out there somewhere? And think about the different aspects of the life course, different BPSC factors, and where we can get to this good long life. So keeping in this mindset of your longevity, I want to share with you a quiz that I made up. And it's not something that you can like tally and say, oh, great, I'm going to live till 91. But it is something to think about with all of these different factors that we know in research. So I'm just going to peruse through these, and you can think to yourself. Fill out the answers based on your life, your lifestyle. Where do you live now? Where did you grow up and spend most of your life? How often do you see your friends and family? That could be remotely or in person. Did you or do you ever smoke? How long? Which, if any, chronic diseases run in your family? How many servings of vegetables do you eat in a typical day? How much meat? How much sugary or processed foods? On a scale from 1 to 10, how stressed do you feel on a typical day? I'm going to guess that given what we've talked about, lots of you are on the high numbers end of that. I'm certainly there. Do you consider yourself a resilient person, able to cope with stressors well? Do you expect the best things in your life? Do you feel a sense of purpose in your life? Agree or disagree with this statement? It is a privilege to grow old. Do you struggle to make ends meet? Perhaps you might live from paycheck to paycheck and or loan period to loan period. And finally, I've asked you to think about this before as we talked about the social side, but write down the 3 people you spend the most time with during the average week. Okay. So your answers to these questions, and you can go back to this if you want, are going to kind of be ticked off as we talk about what makes a good long life for people. Let's start off with a little bit of definitions here, because there are a few terms that we need to clarify. What is longevity? What's the deal with that? And versus lifespan, life expectancy, and all of those things kind of get thrown in together. But your lifespan is how long you can theoretically live. So as humans, we have a lifespan right now, like I have said earlier, is about 122 is the longest we have lived. That's our lifespan. If you look at animals, all kinds, mammals of all types, and we all have different lifespans. So we look at insects and one-celled organisms, et cetera, much shorter. The general rule is usually the smaller, the less time you live, but not necessarily so. So I want to contrast that with longevity, which is how long you will live, right? Your longevity. And that's really when we transition into health span. There is this growing gap that we see between our life, how long we can live well and how long we can live well, right? So you might live until you're 95, but how many of those years were a health span or living healthy or living to your capacity, right, of health? In the US, you can see how our life expectancy holds up to different countries. When we're looking at, you can see this is 2017 paper in Nature and men and women. In the US, we're about 76.1 years for men, 81.1 years for women. That's on average for, right, everybody in the US. There is that 5-year difference that women gain for a number of different reasons, but some of it is actually just biology and has been linked to things like testosterone, believe it or not. And and not just a biological mechanism of testosterone on your body, but the way in which testosterone levels may or may not interact with how you act, which is again commingled with how you're socialized to be, right? But there is that gap in life expectancy still. In almost every country, you see like a sizable gap between men and women. It looks like South Korea, maybe Australia. These places get the closest of almost having overlap in their error bars, but women still tend to have an edge. And another thing that I talked about in my preamble is that aging is not a disease. Aging is a biological process. We talked about, should we cure aging? And some of you debated this, right, in your reflection, but diseases are associated with age. They can co-vary with age, right? But they are not age related per se. You can get cancer at any age, tend to get it at older ages. Again, that's often because the toxins that you're exposed to over time will build up, and or genetically exposure will happen or expression will happen at a certain time. So if they're not causally linked, age does not cause disease. There are plenty of folk who won't have any of those types of diseases, but there will be normal age-related changes in their body over time, right? So eyesight, you tend to have poor eyesight over time and poor hearing, and you do have some cognitive slowing in terms of processing speed, and your gait will probably change. You tend to lose more of your cellulite or your fat cells around like things like your feet, which is why it can be more painful sometimes to walk for longer times. So there are definite physical changes that will happen with your body, but that's not disease, but it can be discomfort, and it will mean adaptation a lot of times. Compressing morbidity. So this is about enlarging the health span, right? So if you look at the compression of morbidity is a very narrow term, right? The goal is to increase your lifespan. So instead of at the top where you're looking at perhaps you had pneumonia in your, maybe late teens, and then you started with emphysema processes, right? Because your lungs were damaged. You might have had a heart attack around your 50s and then a stroke and then lung cancer, but all before you died. Whereas the same process, but in a healthier body, you progress longer and longer without expressing these types of diseases because your body is healthier over time, and you've compressed that morbidity to very last or after death. So that's the one hachée that you'll see on the module. The front picture of the module is you go and go and go and go, and it works and it works and it works until finally at the very end, you basically break down. That might seem harsh, but you have a few things at the end that then you become potentially more frail, and or your body gives out, right? So that's the idea, is that we're looking to increase the health span or compress morbidity, if any, to the very end by living largely healthier lifestyles, having more access to good care, etc. So what are the targets of this health span? You know them well, right? So we're talking about the bio, the psycho, the social, and the culture, environmental things. These broad areas are things that you'll target, and you notice them on the quiz as well. And these are things that we have our interview with Dr. Vanetta Dotson, which is linked in your module this week. She talks about this as well. This is her bread and butter. She's in healthy aging and healthy brains, and she's working to help folk who are in that midpoint in life make some healthy lifestyle changes to prevent any cognitive decline or significant cognitive decline in their life, which you can do, right? And you can change a lot about your life if you change to healthy behaviors. And there is a great TED talk about changing your gene. Your genes are not your fate, that I can also link, which talks a lot about these changes in lifestyle and how they can affect you in ways that you wouldn't have known, in more like epigenetic ways as well. And certainly in neuroplasticity, where your brain is regenerating cells, growing different pathways, and you may not express pathology that is actually there, but you don't express it because you have regenerated, in a sense, and their brain is plastic or has plasticity and is resilient as well. Just throw back to research methods in developmental research. So how do we study longevity? So there are a lot of different designs that you can use in strategies, but oftentimes you'll see these different types of studies, which is a centenarian study where it's a retrospective look back, right? So you're identifying individuals or groups who are living to 100 plus, and you're studying backwards, right? So a retrospective, probably cohort study, where you're looking at specific cohorts retrospectively and saying what predicted this type of life. We'll talk about that with the blue zones in just a second. Prospective studies are those that you plan and study forward, right? So you follow individuals across the life course longitudinally. You're most likely interested in healthy aging predictors. You probably have a multidisciplinary team of folks who are looking at different questions, but these are very commonly funded, large funded studies that are following cohorts over time, and perhaps even enrolling several different cohorts in a panel study. We also see some ethnographic studies. So the Blue Zones is also an ethnographic study because you're immersed in this cultural group of people, and you're documenting their lifestyle, you're looking at their environment, you're digging into their cultural factors and the meanings that they have around things. And you can pinpoint different predictors or different patterns of factors that are in these longevity cultures and study them this way. So we have an example of that in the Blue Zones, which is such a cool study. I mean, if you haven't looked at it, they have their own website. There's a book, there's tons of stuff, bluezones.com. There's a TED talk that you should be looking at this week on it too. And it really is cool because they identified these pockets, these geographic pockets of super centenarians who are 100 plusers. And he's Dan Buettner, who's a demographer, looked to do an ethnographic centenarian study. So they went to all of these different blue zone pockets to take a deep dive into what's happening with these folks. And they found these consistent patterns a lot of these places that overlapped. And some of them were unique to the culture, that specific culture, but then a lot were shared across. And they came up with the Power 9. So if you move naturally, or you have more of an active culture, which they saw in a lot of these places that are a little bit more agrarian, a little bit more raise your own food, or were active with each other naturally, not just exercising, but if you tend to move in spaces and walk instead of all driving or all sitting, that helped. If you have a sense of purpose, if you can downshift, right? Relax, spend time in meditation or mindfulness, cope with stress, take time out. The 80% rule, which was eat till you're 80% full, right? So, or 80% of your plate, if you will. So a lot of these cultures, they had more of a sense of, I don't need to eat it all. I don't need to be full up. I am good. I ate up to 80%. So it wasn't, their
very contrasted to US culture, right? Where we have these gigantic plates, fill them up, we have buffets everywhere, right? It's bigger is better, right? Which is very different in these cultures. A lot of them were plant-based, so a lot of vegetarian cultures here. Not all of them, but a lot of them at least heavy emphasis on plant based diets. Wine at 5. So this was in particular for a few of the cultures, you can guess probably Italy, right? But they had a glass of red wine every day, right? Which they also shared with friends, which is belonging and socialness. You have the right tribe, which I have asked you about a couple of times, right? Who are your people? What are their behaviors like? So you surround yourself with folk who are also living healthy lives or choosing healthy lifestyles. Putting your loved ones first. So again, that connection, that deep rooted connection with people, and um, more than just having friends, but having deep connections with people and prizing them, right? So, and then belonging, feel like you belong to a place, to people, to something. So these are the Power 9. They showed up all over your quiz too. And these are things that were predictive of supercentenarians across the globe. Let's break down some of the BTS factors just quickly. So there are obvious biological connections to healthy aging. So depending on the meta-analysis, right, you have about 15 to 30% of your health is due to genetics. So there are, things that you are born with that will put you at risk or give you opportunity for better aging. But again, like I said, before, the good news is that means 70% of it is not fate, right? Is not just genetic fate, but there are malleable things about that. So there are guesses that there can be longevity genes, right? So some of us probably have a guess that they've had those in their lives. Certainly my grandparents lived incredibly healthy lives up until their 90s in terms of healthy aging, right? They had a few diseases here and there, but they had their cognition, they had their mobility, they had their, I know, um, social connections and everything. So even though they didn't eat the greatest in their lives, but I will say that they led active lives as farmers. So I definitely have benefited from some of that genetics as well. All right, so what's the P part, right? We've hinted at that with some of our stuff, but behavior change, health behavior change. So quitting smoking. We know that smoking is a big risk factor for morbidity, for earlier death, etc. So quitting smoking at any time gives you gains. Also, we know that your attitude about aging, right? We've been talking about this and how your perceptions of aging and your perceptions of your own aging will make a difference to how long you live, and that interacts with a lot of things like the behaviors you choose, your sense of fatalism versus not. So if you have optimism, you gain 11 to 15% more longevity with higher optimism, even after adjusting for all of the health factors you can think of. So that optimism, those positive aging attitudes, they're a big deal. Having purpose in life. So the older adults with the lower sense of purpose were twice as likely to have died 5 years later. Having a sense of purpose, having a meaning, having personhood, those things are key. And at any level, we're going to talk about personhood and dementia and how it's important to have purpose and to feel like a whole being, however that is, in whatever situation you're in. Certainly your diet, your exercise, those things are going to be super important as well. And those are all our bread and butter, right? We're in behavior change. We can do this with our people. We've talked about this before, right? We talked about this last week with the critical S. So you know that how important your social health is to your physical health. One interesting thing I wanted to bring to your attention is the rise of co-housing. So here's a picture of a Cambridge co-housing. There's actually a couple of them in the area in Boston. I don't know how many there are in the Denver or wider Denver area, but that's something you could look up. But co-housing is one of those awesome social connection phenomena that is when they're age integrated, intergenerational, like super awesome, right? So we're talking about a community who purposefully interacts with each other, lives in the same spaces, have similar common areas, they're friends, they're neighbors, and they have their own space as well, but everybody contributes. So you can see a lot of these reciprocal, age integrated, anti-ageist, like those kinds of social program rules that we talked about. And co-housing has become kind of a, a burgeoning like business too for people who are interested. So there are a lot of there are a lot of people who also just got together and said, let's do this and let's like find a space that we're in and help. And Beacon Village in Boston was a really interesting example of that, because it was a group of people who lived in Beacon Hill, which is a more affluent place in Boston, but it's also older. And they were having troubles, right, with their multi-level homes and everybody aging together and aging well. So they put a co-op together to be able to, help one another when they can, when someone's going to the grocery store to help someone else. They put in common kind of dues if they can to help with programming and things like that. So they're really cool examples of using these therapeutic and social connection principles to increase your social wellness factor in aging and therefore age better. All of these things are encapsulated in where you live and their contexts, right? And just cultural values and all of the things that make that up. So the context in which you live is actually really important, the place, right? And this is one of those things that feels very deterministic at times, because a lot of people who are at a disadvantage and who are either, when we think about urban older adults, et cetera, and who've had rent control or who live in places and that can't really go anywhere else given the mobility issues or financial issues, and they can't move away and they're not upwardly mobile. These feel um, less easy to intervene on, but they're not impossible to do, because there are co-housing movements, there's new housing movements. Housing in itself is a huge policy area where I think we can be much more active, but also active in doing things like um, environmental justice and advocacy around environmental justice for communities that have, plants, not plant, but industrial plants, and exposure to diesel exhaust and things that are causing them health disparities that affect, right, compound over time and affect their life course wellness. Here's an example of how place matters. So just moving in retirement can give you more years on average of life than where you lived before. So you see that in some of these places, right, you get a larger boost than others, but there's health capital in certain places where you go because of the things that we've been talking about, but also because of things like natural resources and green space and lack of toxin exposure, et cetera, and or your squad, right? Like the people that like to be active like you do, or like to walk, or like to go to theater, or whatever it is, sit out and play cards. Those things are associated with place as well. But it's interesting to look that just by moving, you can increase your likelihood of having healthy aging, right? I want to give you an example of finding health capital in Boston. So this is from the census tract in 2003, 2007. So it's a little bit old, but you can bet that these definitely still exist. So health outcomes vary as much as 33 years between different census tracts in Boston. It is amazing. Within the same districts, not that far away, life expectancy in Roxbury areas, which if you're familiar with Boston, it is one of the more historically poor and Black and brown neighborhoods in Boston, is around 58.9 years, which is a shorter life expectancy than some third world, not all of these are countries, right? And hugely different than the 91.9 years that you're getting up there in places like Beacon Hill and Charlestown and, the nice areas of this district and Jamaica Plain and, the equivalent, which I wanted to show you in Denver. And this was done by a health equity group at VCU. So you can see that Center on Society and Health. So if you know things about Denver, you may have guessed some of these things, but there are pretty big health disparities when you look at just moving into slightly different areas. 10, I mean, it's not 33, but 2, 5, 10. I mean, those are big deals, right? And you can imagine that not just like life longevity, but health span, right? Differences too. So really interesting how place really defines a lot of our parameters and how advocacy is needed in order to improve housing and environmental justice and things that really make a difference, but that also things like health behavior change and increasing lifestyle and access to things can really make a huge difference. And we can do that on an individual level too. All right. So what can we do? This is not a gloom and doom. This is a get up there and make a difference, right? So you can do a lot of things today to impact your own health and your family's health. Got to own that 70%. We're leaving it on the table if we're not doing something, right? And that's a huge amount, right? So you've already been dealt your 15 to 30%, although there are definitely things that change epigenetically, but you've got a lot to work with. And encourage change, right? We've talked about this before in the anti-ageist movement, is that people don't think old people can change or should change or need to change or even care about if they do because they're old. Well, they're just going to die. Age is not disability. Age is age, right? And it doesn't necessarily come with anything, but at any level, it's important that to emphasize that there are goals, movement, and wellness to be had. And this is a huge boon for policy and advocacy in our field. We need people who are doing research and advocacy to help move these dials in housing policy and environmental justice and get into city hall and get in at the county and the public health agency levels. I think that we can do a lot of things to make a difference in those spaces as well. So, all right. That's my healthy aging talk. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.